On the 15th of last month, The Beacon, which is Whakatane's local newspaper, published a whimsical article on page 2 about how me and Charlotte lost Jimmy, the dinghy that we tow behind us, in some rough seas while trying to cross the Ohiwa Bar. It's lucky we also didn't lose Arcadian. We were travelling from Tauranga to Ahopi. It was the first part in a 6-leg journey that was taking us to Napier. We were going to Ahopi, Hicks Bay, Tolaga Bay, Gisborne, Mahia, and then finally Napier. 6 full days of sailing with only 8 days to get it done because I needed to be in Auckland to do some experiments for my PhD, and Charlotte had some locum vet work in Hamilton. So the time frame was tight and we only had 2 days to wait out bad weather, and there was some quite big northerly swells, but the window was opening up, so we were off, expecting the first day to be a little bit rough and for it to ease up after that. There were 2-metre northerly swells which rocked the boat around quite a lot, and a slight headwind which stopped us raising any sails, so the journey was uncomfortable but it wasn't crazy. The big problem we had was that we were quite underprepared. Aside from the boat being a huge mess because we hadn't had time to stow everything away properly, we hadn't really sussed out where we were going that well, which was the Hiwa Bar. Now, I'd googled it and found out that there was heaps of boats within the harbour, checked the depths on the charts to make sure that we could actually get through, and then I'd also read the chapter in the Akarana cruising handbook, which didn't make it sound outrageous. But it was a bar crossing and I didn't really appreciate how the big northerly swells that we were experiencing were going to make our life difficult. I knew that some bars, like down south in Greymouth, had full-on crossings, but I didn't think too much about this one. As I approached the bar, I couldn't find a gap in any of the breakers, and at this point I should have reassessed, but it was getting quite late and we wanted to pack it in for the night, so I ploughed through and I got to the point where the waves were starting to break, and they seemed a lot bigger than what they had at a distance, and they were starting to break over the back of Jimmy and filling him up with water. They also looked like they were getting to the point where they were going to start breaking and coming over to the back of our boat, which is quite worrying in Arcadian because we don't have a self-draining cockpit. And that's where any water that breaks over the boat into the cockpit can drain back out into the sea. In our boat, any water that comes over ends up draining into the bilge, which is the bottom of the boat, and it can fill up and sink. The other thing that was starting to get me quite worried was that the chart was telling me that where we were was 6 meters deep, but our depth sounder, which actually measures it, was saying there was only 1.5 meters. And at this point I had 2 options. I could kind of commit and leg it through the bar with the risk of running aground because I don't know where the channel is anymore, in which case I'd be stuck and all these waves would be constantly hitting us. Or I can try and spin the boat around, but the risk being that I don't get the boat all the way around before a wave comes and kind of washes over the side of us like. But Arcadian's got quite a tight turning circle and the waves seemed like they were far enough apart, so I decided I better get out now while I still can. So I waited for the next wave to roll over the back of us, and then I turned the boat around and had a little bit of time before, we ploughed into the next one. And we headed through about 3 or 4 of these big breaking waves that flooded over the deck and then spilled through the air vents, flooding everything that we'd stored in the bow, including Charlotte, who was kind of having a bit of a nap at the time. And the jarring motion of the boat coming over the waves also put quite a lot of strain on the rope towing Jimmy, who was now filled with water and quite heavy, and eventually it gave way and snapped. And I turned around to see him kind of just wandering off into the horizon, but I was in no position to go chasing after him because I was lucky to have just got Arcadian out in one piece. And we still weren't out of the woods yet. We had nowhere for the boat to anchor for the night, and there was a thunderstorm approaching. I thought about going back one bay to Whakatane and trying to cross the bar there, but after we radioed the Coast Guard, they said that was a dumb idea and that we were better to go and anchor on the south side of Whale Island for the night, which is what we did. Now the rough trip from Tauranga the day before, combined with the night of being bobbed around, meant that I was quite crook the next day, being seasick for the first time on Arcadian. And Charlotte wasn't faring much better. We wanted to find out if anyone had seen Jimmy washed ashore, so I got a hold of the Coast Guard, who sent a message out of the VHF to all the boaties to keep an eye out, and Charlotte started looking at the Lost and Found forums, but ended up somehow talking to a reporter from the Beacon who took our story and turned it into an article. Quite a colourful article too, I think. My favourite part was when we were quoted for saying that Jimmy would be missing its mothership and likely lost and confused. I've put a link to the full story in the description below for those of you who want to have an actual read. We stayed at Whale Island the next day and the next night, and I was kind of just internalising what had happened. Like, it had shaken me quite a bit, and it made me realise just how underprepared we were. We hadn't talked to anyone about those bar crossings, and we didn't have a plan B for when things went bad. And then so the next day we were heading back to Tauranga. We weren't going to get to Napier to meet our deadline, and we didn't have a dinghy to get to shore anywhere. We also wanted to get back so that we could go drive to the beach and have another look to see if we can find Jimmy. Thankfully the sail back was a lot nicer, like the swell had calmed down and the weather was quite good. And as soon as we got back, we jumped in the car and headed to the Hiwa beach. It was a real choice evening and the dogs loved it, but no sign of Jimmy. I started thinking over the entire trip. From the beginning, I wanted to get all the way around New Zealand to the north, south and Stewart Island, and decided it would take about 6 months to do so. But I'd since taken a teaching role which was going to take a month off at the end, and we just spent 4 weeks fixing up Arcadian. There was also a couple of weeks here and there where I was needing to go back up to Auckland to do PhD work. So all of a sudden my 6 months had been whittled down to about 3.5, 4. Now it's 2,700 miles, nautical miles, to get around New Zealand, and Arcadian can go at a speed of about 4 knots. It would take 2 full months of sailing 12 hours a day to cover the distance, which meant that more than half of my time now would be spent like this. When I think of the reasons for starting the trip in the first place, 2 of the big ones were learning to sail and then seeing New Zealand from a perspective that not everyone gets to experience. And it started to dawn on me that neither of these 2 were going to be accomplished at my current plan. Firstly, if you've got 50 miles to cover in a day before you can get to a safe anchorage, you're getting there regardless of what the wind's doing, so the motor's almost always going to be on. And if the wind is not behaving, it's sort of too weak or in the wrong direction, then you might not even have the sails up at all. Secondly, any day where I'm not at the tiller for 12 hours a day, I'm going to be waiting out bad weather, which means I'm not going to get to experience that much of New Zealand, at least not in any nice conditions. Long story short, we've decided to change our plans from sailing around New Zealand to just heading northward, going and exploring kind of the Gulf and the barriers and the Bay of Islands and Northland, and just taking our time, going where the wind takes us rather than motoring against it. Sailing around New Zealand's still something that I'm wanting to do, but it will be another time and in another boat. Arcadian's not the most suited boat for a trip around New Zealand, and I brought it at a time when I knew absolutely nothing about sailing or boats. She's more of a camper van of the sea rather than a stout ocean-going vessel. But for somewhere like the Hodaki Gulf and the Bay of Islands, a sea camper van's exactly what you need. So we plan on making the most of Arcadian in the time we've got, and we'll continue sharing our adventures in these videos. Join us next time when we take Arcadian back to Auckland, but this time take a little bit more time and do a lot more exploring.